What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Nerdy Professor Podcast, your central location for everything black, bold, and beautiful. I'm your host, the Nerdy Professor. Last time we talked about the abolitionist movement and the various forms of resistance African Americans used to break free of bondage, as well as some key figures like John Brown, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and a few others. Today, we continue our journey through history, shifting our focus a little bit to the transformative period following the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, and the Harlem Renaissance. Let's get into it. The Reconstruction era in the United States spanned from 1865 to 1877, following the Civil War, and it sought to rebuild the nation and redefine the status of African Americans as they faced immense opposition. Some key features of the Reconstruction era include the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment, the implementation of federal Reconstruction policies to protect the rights of newly freed slaves, the political participation of African Americans, resistance from white Southerners, the passage of the Reconstruction amendments granting citizenship and voting rights to African Americans, and the eventual end of Reconstruction with the Compromise of 1877, leading to the onset of the Jim Crow era. So, the Reconstruction era was kind of like Naruto's early journey, from being an outcast to earning recognition and respect. After the 13th Amendment, African Americans gained legal freedom, like Naruto gaining acceptance as a ninja. However, like Naruto facing obstacles such as Orochimaru or the Akatsuki, African Americans faced their own oppositions, like the KKK. The ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865 marked a profound shift in the American society, freeing millions of enslaved African Americans. One significant aspect of Reconstruction was the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau provided crucial assistance to newly freed individuals, including education, housing, and legal aid. However, the promise of Reconstruction was short-lived as white supremacist groups, aka the KKK, sought to undermine the rights and freedoms of African Americans through violence and intimidation. During the Reconstruction era, newly freed African Americans and their allies engaged in political activism, forming organizations and advocating for civil rights. They held public meetings, established schools, organized voter registration drives, despite facing violent opposition from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. These acts of resilience laid the groundwork for legal challenges and the eventual passage of constitutional amendments granting citizenship and voting rights. While the Reconstruction era made significant strides towards racial equality, particularly with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, these gains were met with fierce opposition from white Southerners determined to maintain the status quo, to maintain their supremacy. The Compromise of 1877 marked the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and effectively ushered in the era of Jim Crow laws and racial segregation. So, what was the Jim Crow South? Do y'all remember the fight between Naruto and Zabuza? Do y'all remember what it was like for the people that lived in the land of waves? The Jim Crow laws imposed segregation and disenfranchisement, similar to the oppressive regime in the land of waves. The Jim Crow era in southern United States spanned roughly from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, was characterized by legalized racial segregation and discrimination. These laws discriminated against African Americans by making it illegal to do quite literally simplistic things like loitering. The laws enforced racial segregation in public facilities, transportation, education, and housing. These laws perpetuated a system of white supremacy, denying African Americans basic civil rights and reinforcing racial hierarchies. During this era, African Americans faced systemic disenfranchisement through literacy tests, poll taxes, and other measures designed to prevent them from voting. Segregated schools were underfunded and inferior, perpetuating educational inequalities. Public spaces were strictly segregated under Jim Crow, with whites only and colored signs marking everything from parks to theaters. African Americans were also subjected to violence and intimidation, including lynching and other forms of racial violence, which were often done with no risk to the abuser. The landmark Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson, sanctioned racial segregation under the doctrine separate but equal. This ruling provided legal justification for Jim Crow laws, allowing states to enforce segregation as long as facilities for African Americans were deemed equal to those for whites. In practice, however, facilities and services provided for African Americans were almost always inferior and unequal. In the Jim Crow era, African Americans continued to resist systemic oppression through various means. Just as Team 7 fought against Zabuza and Haku, African Americans resisted through civil rights movements, legal challenges, and protests. The NAACP, founded in 1909, spearheaded legal challenges against segregation laws, advocating for equal treatment under the law. Grassroots activists organized boycotts, sit-ins, and marches to protest discriminatory practices in schools, public accommodations, and workplaces. Leaders like Ida B. Wells Barnett documented and exposed the horrors of lynching, using journalism as a tool for social change. These efforts stimulated national awareness and support for the civil rights reform. Alright, let's fast forward a little bit to the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Enter Booker T. Washington. He was a huge figure in the African American history, both literally and figuratively. The man was tall. Washington believed in self-improvement and economic empowerment as pathways to racial progress. In one of his most famous speeches, he states, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential in mutual progress." Essentially saying, let the black population do what it wants, and the white population do what it wants. Fundamentally, African Americans and white Americans should work together towards mutual progress. Washington looked to employ the strategy of economic development for African Americans. He emphasized the need for vocational workers to impact the economic development of the South. His strategies received criticism, but it did provide results. The Tuskegee Institute was the first opportunity for Black people to receive a higher education focusing on skilled craftsmanship. Although Washington's critics felt like he did not place enough emphasis on the racial discrimination and violence that was happening against Blacks. Amongst the changing tides of America, different groups began to form to help African Americans pursue a better life. Organizations like the Afro-American League and the Afro-American Council helped structure future organizations. W.E.B. Du Bois, a historian, sociologist, editor, and civil rights activist, created the Niagara Movement. Du Bois created this movement out of frustration he and others experienced due to societal oppression in America. This era is similar to Naruto's training with Jiraiya. Washington's focus on economic improvement is akin to Naruto learning Sage Jutsu. Du Bois' leadership and activism are also akin to Naruto mastering the Rasengan, both being vital in their respective fields, just like Naruto's Sage Jutsu and Rasengan being vital to him becoming Hokage. During the early 20th century, figures like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois employed different strategies in their resistance efforts. Washington focusing on economic empowerment and vocational education through institutions like the Tuskegee Institute, promoting self-sufficiency within the Black community. On the other hand, Du Bois, through the Niagara Movement and later the NAACP, advocated for full civil rights, challenging racial segregation and disenfranchisement through legal and political means. Their intellectual contributions and organizational leadership bolstered the fight for racial equality. So I previously mentioned the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Founded in 1909, the NAACP became one of the most influential civil rights organizations in the United States. Their fearless warriors in the battle for justice, fighting against segregation, discrimination, and racial violence with every tool at their disposal. Through legal means, lobbying for federal anti-lynching laws, and challenging segregation in education and public accommodation. The NAACP, like the Niagara Movement, had goals of abolishing segregation, discrimination, disenfranchisement, and racial violence, particularly lynching. The NAACP is significant to early 20th century activism because the organization fought for the legal right of African Americans and still continues to do so till this day. A key figure during early 19th century activism was Marcus Garvey. Garvey was a Jamaican-born leader, and he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, aka the UNIA, in 1914. The aim was to unite and uplift the black people globally. He established a chapter in Harlem in 1916, spreading the UNIA's message of racial pride. Garvey advocated for a Back to Africa movement and founded the Black Star Line in 1919 to facilitate trade and relocation to Africa. However, Garvey was an excellent leader, but he was not a good businessman. Garvey's outspokenness and growing influence attracted the attention of the authorities, leading to legal troubles, a reoccurring theme. In 1922, he was convicted of mail fraud related to the Black Star Line's activities and was imprisoned and later deported to Jamaica in 1927. Garvey and the UNIA's use of the Black Star Steamship Corporation was a monumental idea for the black world, but it had poor execution. Despite facing legal troubles and business challenges, his leadership inspired thousands. During the early 20th century, black people wanted to prove their race was not inferior. The idea that they needed to prove that their race was indeed on par with other races spurred the concept of black nationalism. Another prominent organization during the early 20th century was the National Urban League. They championed economic empowerment and social justice for African Americans. They worked to dispel racial discrimination within the civic life of African Americans. The organization worked on both the local scale as well as the national scale. The organization also created a social work program at Fisk University to combat the lack of social workers in the black communities. It also created programs for at-risk youth like the Big Brother and Big Sister programs and Boys and Girls Club. The National Urban League also helped African Americans get jobs during the Great Migration. It also worked to create opportunities for black communities and open doors that were closed by racism. They are out there on the front lines breaking down barriers and creating opportunities where, quite frankly, none existed before. The Great Migration stands as a pivotal movement in African American history. This movement itself was a form of resistance as millions of African Americans left the South for urban centers like Chicago, Detroit, and New York City between the early 20th century and the 1970s. They sought better employment prospects, access to education, and escape from racial violence. This mass exodus reshaped urban demographics and contributed to the growth of vibrant African American communities in these urban centers. We also see cultural and artistic movements such as the Harlem Renaissance during this time. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural and intellectual movement that flourished primarily in Harlem, New York City during the 1920s and 1930s. It also resembles Naruto's journey in the Chunin exam. This migration brought together a diverse and vibrant community of African American artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals. Like Naruto and his peers showcasing their abilities, writers such as Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Gene Toomer produced poetry, novels, and essays that captured the vibrancy and struggles of African American life. Zora Neale Hurston, an anthropologist, novelist, and folklorist, celebrated for her novels and collections of African American folklore after her death. Jazz became synonymous with the Harlem Renaissance, with musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong pioneering new styles that blended African American musical traditions with modern influences. The Harlem Renaissance coincided with a period of profound racial discrimination and segregation in the United States, but served as both cultural expression and resistance. African American artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals used their talents to challenge stereotypes and celebrate Black identity. Through literature, jazz, and visual arts, they asserted their humanity and demanded recognition in society that often marginalized their contributions. This cultural renaissance not only enriched American art and literature, but also provided a platform for advocacy and social commentary. Despite the challenges they faced, African Americans found strength in their cultural heritage and traditions. Music, art, and literature became powerful forms of resistance, allowing individuals to assert their humanity and demand recognition and respect. But resistance was not confined to a cultural sphere. Activists and organizers tirelessly mobilized communities, challenged discriminatory laws, and demanded equal rights under the law. Alright, if you take nothing from this episode, take this. Resistance was not confined to just the cultural sphere. Activists and organizers tirelessly mobilized communities, challenged discriminatory laws, and demanded equal rights under the law. During the Reconstruction era, African Americans employed various strategies to resist oppression and assert their rights. They actively participated in politics by electing Black officials and engaging in advocacy through organizations like the Union League. They challenged discriminatory laws in court, built their own schools, churches, and businesses to foster community and economic independence, and also organized self-defense groups to protect against violence from hate organizations like the KKK. Educational institutions and national organizations also played critical roles in supporting African American advancements. Organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League played a crucial role in advancing the cause of civil rights. It is also crucial that we understand that Du Bois and Washington were both fighting for the same thing, just in different ways. The Harlem Renaissance had a profound impact on African American identity and cultural pride. It challenged stereotypes and highlighted the richness and diversity of African American culture. By celebrating this heritage and creating a platform for artistic expression, the Harlem Renaissance artists and intellectuals fostered a sense of unity and pride within the African American community. Their works contributed to a broader understanding of African American history and culture, influencing the generations of artists and activists to come in their fight for civil rights and social justice. Alright, y'all, that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining. I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to drop a like and consider following the podcast for more content like this. As always, I welcome your feedback and suggestions for future topics. Until next time, peace.